The envelope was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home from the lawyer's office, but I barely noticed it. My hands were still shaking. I had driven 40 minutes back from downtown Ottawa in a kind of trance, stopping twice at green lights because my mind simply wasn't there. It was somewhere back in that oak-paneled office, watching Gerald Whitmore, my father's estate lawyer, slide a document across the desk toward me and say, very quietly, "Margaret, your father left everything to you. The house in Rockcliffe Park, the investment portfolio, the cottage on the Rideau, all of it. $4.7 million. I kept saying the number to myself on the drive home. Not with excitement, with something closer to grief, because my father had been gone 3 weeks and I still reached for the phone every Sunday morning to call him. $4.7 million, and I would have traded every cent to sit across from him one more time at his kitchen table with bad coffee and the CBC playing in the background. But I had the envelope, and I had the number, and I had a husband at home who I had been married to for 38 years. His name was Donald. Donnie to his mother, before she passed. I had called him Don for almost 4 decades, and I thought I knew the sound of his name, the way I knew the sound of my own heartbeat. I picked up the envelope. It was from the Bank of Montreal. A statement I hadn't opened yet, addressed only to him. I almost set it back down. I had never opened Don's mail. In 38 years of marriage, I had given him that privacy without a second thought. The way you give someone the benefit of the doubt for so long it stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like gravity. I set it down. Then I picked it up again. I don't know what made me open it. Maybe it was something Gerald had said, almost as an afterthought, when I was putting on my coat to leave. He'd cleared his throat and said, "Your father was very deliberate about the structure of this inheritance, Margaret. He was very specific that the assets be titled in your name alone. He mentioned that to me more than once." He paused. "I thought you should know that." I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, thinking about my father, who had been an accountant for 40 years and never did anything without a reason. Then I opened the envelope. It was a line of credit statement. A home equity line of credit attached to our house, the house Don and I had bought together in Canada in 1991, the house we'd raised 2 children in, the house I had painted and refinished and landscaped and considered, without any drama, to be mine as much as his. The balance was $312,000. I read it twice, 3 times. I sat down on the kitchen chair and I read it again because the number refused to mean anything. We didn't have a line of credit. We had never discussed opening a line of credit. Don managed the household finances, and I had let him manage them because he was good with numbers, because he worked in finance, because it was simply how things had evolved over 38 years, until I no longer knew our account numbers by heart or remembered the name of our investment advisor or had any clear picture of where we actually stood. I called our bank. I sat at the kitchen table and I called and I asked about the account, and the woman on the phone confirmed, yes, the account had been open for 4 years. Yes, the primary account holder was Donald. Yes, I was listed as well. Yes. The current balance was $312,000. What was the credit used for? I asked. She told me she could only provide statements. She could mail them or I could come in. Mail them, I said. Mail all of them. Every statement since the account was opened. I hung up, and I sat there in my kitchen and I listened to the house, the refrigerator humming, the heat coming through the vents, the ordinary sounds of a life I had believed I understood completely. Don came home at 6:30 the way he always did. He hung his coat on the hook by the door, the way he always did. He kissed me on the cheek and asked what was for dinner, the way he always did. I said pasta. It's almost ready. I did not mention the statement. I lay awake until 2 in the morning, and then I got up and went to his desk in the study, which I had also never done, not in 38 years, not once. It took me less than 20 minutes to understand that things were much worse than one line of credit. There was a storage unit rental receipt in Barhaven. There were email printouts I didn't understand. There were 2 cell phone bills for a number I didn't recognize, going back almost 3 years, paid by direct transfer from an account I also didn't recognize. I took photographs of everything with my phone. Then I went back to bed and I lay in the dark next to my husband of 38 years, and I breathed very carefully and I did not sleep at all. Her name, I found out 6 days later, was Kathleen. She worked at the same brokerage firm where Don was a senior portfolio manager. She was 44 years old. She lived in a condo in Westboro that, I would eventually learn, Don had helped her purchase. I did not learn any of this by confronting him. I had decided very early, lying in the dark that first night, that I would not confront him until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. My father, the accountant, had taught me that. You don't ask the question until you can already verify the answer. I called my daughter Carolyn, who lives in Vancouver. I told her I needed to talk, and she flew in that weekend, no questions asked, because Carolyn has always been like that, practical and present when it counts. We sat at my kitchen table with the door closed, and I showed her everything I had photographed, and the bank statements that had arrived by mail, and the timeline I had put together in a notebook. Carolyn was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mum, you need a lawyer. Not Dad's kind of lawyer, a family lawyer." "I know," I said. "And you shouldn't touch anything. Don't move any money, don't close any accounts." "I know," I said again. I had already called Gerald Whitmore, the estate lawyer who had referred me to a colleague. Her name was Patricia Chen, and she specialized in high-conflict divorce and financial disputes, and she had an office on Elgin Street, and she had agreed to see me the following Tuesday. What Patricia told me in that first meeting rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. Don had not simply been hiding an affair. He had been, according to Patricia's initial read of the documents I brought her, systematically moving money. The line of credit drawn against our house had been opened 4 years ago. The funds had gone into accounts I had no knowledge of. Some had gone toward the Westboro condo, some had been redirected elsewhere. Patricia used the phrase dissipation of marital assets and told me she wanted a forensic accountant involved before we did anything else. "How long do you think this has been going on?" I asked. She looked at the papers. "At minimum, 4 years based on what you've brought me. But patterns like this usually start earlier than the paper trail shows." I thought about the last 4 years. I thought about the last 10. I tried to identify a moment where something had shifted and I couldn't find it, which was either evidence that I hadn't been paying attention or evidence that Don was very good at this. I suspected it was both. The forensic accountant's name was Robert, and he was thorough and unhurried, and over the following 2 months he put together a picture that made Patricia, who I gathered had seen a great deal in her career, press her lips together and say, "This is significant." Don had been diverting money from our joint investment accounts in small increments for at least 6 years. He had leveraged our house. He had opened accounts in his name alone using our shared assets as collateral. The total amount he had moved, when Robert finished tracing it, was just over $830,000. I want to be clear about something. I am not a woman who fell apart. I had moments in those months standing in the grocery store, driving home from Patricia's office, once at 2 a.m. when I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until I couldn't, but I did not fall apart. I had raised 2 children, cared for my mother through dementia, buried my father, and I was 63 years old, and I understood, at a level I couldn't have articulated, that falling apart was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. What I had, instead of falling apart, was my father's inheritance. Patricia had explained the legal situation clearly. In Ontario, inheritance received during a marriage is generally excluded from equalization, meaning Don had no claim to my father's estate. It was mine. But I needed to keep it clean, keep it separate, document everything. Gerald had already structured the accounts, in my name alone, as my father had apparently instructed him to do. My father had known, not specifically perhaps, but he had known something. He had been 79 years old and sharp until the end, and he had watched his son-in-law for 38 years, and he had told his estate lawyer more than once to make sure the money was in Margaret's name. My father had done quietly, and without drama what he always did, he had protected me. I had Patricia draft the divorce application in October. Don did not know it was coming. I want to tell you about the day he found out, because it matters. It was a Thursday. Don came home at 6:30 the way he always did, hung his coat the way he always did, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with Patricia's articling student who had driven out to Canada to deliver the documents properly. Don walked into the kitchen and stopped. "Margaret," he said, "what's this?" "You've been served," the articling student said, professionally and without drama, and then she let herself out. Don stood in the kitchen holding the envelope, and I looked at him. Really looked at him, the way you sometimes stop seeing someone after decades, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger anymore. I had moved through the anger months ago. What I felt was something closer to pity, and under the pity, something like relief so vast I hadn't known I was carrying the weight of it. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough," I said. "Margaret, I can explain." "Patricia Chen is my lawyer," I said. "You can reach her office directly. I'd like you to stay somewhere else tonight. Carolyn knows. I've told her everything." He started to say something about how we could talk about this, about 38 years, about what this would do to the family. His voice was the voice I had known for 38 years, and it landed differently now, like a song you've heard so many times the words have gone hollow. "The forensic accountant's report is referenced in the filing," I said. "Patricia can walk your lawyer through the details." He left. Our son, Daniel, called me 2 days later. Daniel is 41 and lives in Toronto, and he and his father have always been close in the way that fathers and sons sometimes are, a proximity I had always been happy about and now found complicated. "Mum," he said, "Dad told me his side. I just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm okay," I said. "He says this is a misunderstanding, that the accounts were for tax reasons, that you two had just stopped communicating about money." I was quiet for a moment. I thought carefully about what I wanted to say to my son, because I loved Daniel, and I didn't want to wound him, but I also wasn't going to lie to protect a narrative his father had constructed. "Honey," I said, "Robert Mackenzie, the forensic accountant, documented $830,000 moved without my knowledge over 6 years. That's not a communication issue. That's in the court documents, you can read them." Daniel was quiet. "I'm not asking you to choose sides," I said, "but I am asking you not to carry his version of events to me. I know what happened. I have the records." He apologized, not for his father, but for coming to me with it. We've been okay since, he and I. Careful, but okay. Carolyn flew back in January. She stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping in the guest room, making soup, driving me to appointments, doing precisely what she had always done when things were hard, which was to simply be physically present without making a performance of it. I don't think I told her enough times how much that meant to me. The divorce was finalized the following spring. Under Ontario's equalization rules, we divided the marital assets, but the $830,000 Don had dissipated was factored into the calculation, which meant my equalization payment was significantly reduced. The Canada house was sold, and I received my share. The line of credit against it was Don's liability. My father's estate remained entirely mine, $4.7 million untouched. Patricia had done an extraordinary job. She was calm and precise and never let me feel like a victim, which was important, because I was not interested in being a victim. Don did not go to jail. I want to be honest about that, because in stories like this there is sometimes a tidier ending. The dissipation of marital assets is a civil matter, not a criminal one. And while Robert's report was damning and the courts took it seriously, Don paid his penalty through the equalization process and walked away, diminished but free. Kathleen, I was told by someone who still moved in his circles, ended the relationship sometime during the divorce proceedings. I don't know if that's true, and I found when I heard it that I genuinely didn't care. What I do know is this. I am 63 years old, and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Glebe, which I chose because it is near the canal, and near good coffee, and near a library I can walk to, and because it is entirely mine. I bought it outright. No mortgage. No line of credit. No account I haven't signed myself. I speak to Carolyn every Sunday morning. I am learning, badly and joyfully, to play the piano, which I always wanted to do and somehow never did. I have coffee with Patricia every couple of months, because we became something like friends through all of it, which I didn't expect. And I think about my father. I think about him telling Gerald, more than once, to put it in Margaret's name. I think about him sitting across from me at his kitchen table with bad coffee, asking questions about our finances the way he occasionally did, careful questions that I had always answered vaguely because Don handled all of that. I think about what my father must have seen or suspected and chose to address not with confrontation, but with precision quietly, through a lawyer, through the structure of a will. He never said a word to me about it. He protected me without telling me I needed protecting, which is exactly the kind of man he was. A few weeks after the divorce was final, I was going through the last of the boxes from the Canada house, things I'd had in storage and kept putting off dealing with. At the bottom of one box was a card my father had given me on my wedding day. I had kept it 38 years without rereading it. I sat on the floor of my apartment and I read it. He had written, "Margaret, you have always been smarter than you give yourself credit for. Trust that. Love, Dad." I sat there for a long time. Then I put the card on my bookshelf, where I can see it from the kitchen table. And I went and made myself a decent cup of coffee.